Hello and welcome to Greater Perspectives. I'm really excited about our guest here today. He's a professor of mathematical education at The Ohio State University, an affiliate of the UCLA Mathematics Project, and a research fellow at Harvard. He is a proponent of bringing equity to mathematics and teaching mathematics through social justice, a self-described storyteller and organizer. And I'm really excited to have this conversation here today because it feels like we're going to learn a lot, not only about DEI, a concept which I'm personally a little skeptical of, but also about the possibility of questioning our own beliefs and learning a lot more today. And I hope you do too. Dr. Theodore Chao, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited about this.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the warm introduction, John. I'm looking forward to this conversation too.
Maybe we can go a little bit into your background and what you do, and that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. This work in particular, I started when I was a classroom teacher, right? So I started my education career as a 7th and 8th grade middle school teacher at IS 318, Eugenio de Hostos Intermediate School in Brooklyn, New York. And, from there, I think that's where I really started to understand, the role of education and really how it plays a role into, how we want our future societies to be, right? One of your employees, Nina Lynn, was one of my students. And I remember just really being struck by not just Nina in the classroom, but also, the very intense sort of racial demographics that are in a place like Brooklyn, New York, right? We had students who were Black with ancestry in the Caribbean. We had students who were Black with ancestry from the mainland United States. We had students who were Black who were, saw themselves as more African, or whose ancestry was directly from Africa within 1 or 2 generations. And they saw each other very differently, right? And yet, as a teacher coming in, as someone who's Chinese American, it's easy for me to say, oh, these are all my Black students, right? But the nuances, right, of the ways they interact with each other play into the ways that they even socialize, and even even into small things. Like if I want to put my students into groups of 4 and have them work on some graphing, right, how they're going to interact and listen to each other, and even what sort of prior knowledge they're bringing back in. So, my own background has always been centered around how does learning happen, right? How do we ensure we create spaces for children to learn well? And in my world of mathematics, it's how do I get kids to not hate math, right?
Yeah.
How do I get kids to realize math is something that's really cool and something that really engages them to become the best version of themselves and to have a lot of power in their own career and their own life. Some of it's through activism, particularly through organizing around schools and communities, but a lot of it is really just trying to destigmatize some of the terrible ways that we teach math in this country, right? And getting rid of a lot of our own mathematical traumas.
My background is in mathematics and computer science, emphasis more on the computer science than mathematics. If you were to ask me math questions, I would fail miserably today. But that being said, it's the forever question kids always have is, why do I need to know this? Why do I need to understand algebra? Why do I need to understand whatever it might be? And for me, personally, I think math is possibly the most important subject out of all of the, elementary level subjects that children should be learning.
I agree, right? But, I don't want to categorize them, right? But it's hard not to, right? As a math teacher, right? I think math is the most important, right? But, everything else is important, right? I think right now we live in a world in which, we talk more about literacy rather than reading, right? We talk about social, emotional intelligence, right?
Sorry, what's the difference between literacy and reading in your mind?
So reading is maybe just a procedural skill of being able to understand how to read words, pronounce them, and then process them, right? Whereas literacy is being able to read and understand context, understand themes, understand the different nuances, understand, and being critical, right? Understand when someone is trying to write something that has a specific spin or propaganda behind it.
And so I'm assuming that the equivalent in mathematics to literacy and reading is something like being able to do your additions versus being able to apply whatever it is that you've learned in mathematics.
Yeah, exactly, John. So, my background is also in computer science, right? So before I became a teacher, I also lived in the startup world. I started a streaming media company back in 2000 when, at the time, only 10% of the United States had broadband access. So it was probably the worst timing to start a streaming media company. But, in computer science, I really, when I was an undergrad in college is when I really started to understand why I learned all this math, right? Because I remember okay, wow, eigenvectors. Now I get it, right? I understanding why we need to have these systems in which we have dimensions more than 3, right? I'm starting to understand why it's important to sort things quickly And I think that that's sort of the difference between what we call mathematical literacy and being able to do math, right? And I think for many of us in this country, math is often taught in a way where it really dehumanizes the child, right?
Mhm.
It's, hey, I'm really curious about this. Can you tell me like why exactly, y equals mx plus b? Like this is the standard algorithm we use. And then, sometimes like, I've been in classrooms where a teacher says, I don't really know, but you need to memorize this and just follow
Yeah.
my lead.
And that's incredibly frustrating because kids want to know why.
Yeah, yeah, right. I think all of us, as a student, you should have we have fundamental rights as students, right? And students should have a
Mhm.
right to make sense of what they're learning, right? They should have a right
Yeah.
to understand why it's important in their life. And yet, I think a lot of math is often taught in ways, right? Exactly what you're talking about, John. It's,
Mhm.
hey, just stop thinking, stop trying to make sense of it, and just follow along. And then math just becomes this magical thing where you're just sort of guessing, like, maybe I memorized this right, maybe I did it. I'm just going to guess, and that just
Yeah.
becomes really traumatic, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, the real world application of any kind of mathematics is incredibly important because then it sticks in kids' head and then they're going, "Oh, now I get it. Now I understand why I need to learn this." 100%. And so what I'm curious about is we've talked about this concept of introducing, I guess, diversity and kind of opening up mathematics for more people. How would you describe the problem today with mathematics and education in that regard?
Yeah. So I think one of the issues, particularly when we talk about diversity and inclusion and equity as it connects to math education, right? One is issues of access, right? That's the very first one, right? If we look closely, I mean, I work at a university and I was at Harvard and I'm now affiliated with UCLA. I mean, these are all amazing, wonderful institutions. And yet, if I were to take you with me to campus and I'd say, hey, we're going to go visit the engineering quad.
Mhm.
And I'd say, hey, take a guess as to what the ethnic and gender breakdown of all the faculty here in the math department are and the engineering department are. We
Mhm.
could probably take a good guess ethnically what we're going to see, and maybe in terms of gender, what we're going to see. We're going to see, probably a lot more males than females. We'll probably see a lot of European, white, and Asian people, right? We probably won't see a lot of Black and Latinx people, right? We probably won't see a lot of differently able people, right? And so, one thing that we talk about in terms of math is why is that, right? We know that there's not like a particular like ethnic connection to mathematics, right? But why, when we look into these spaces of who's you know at the university level being able to become a professor of engineering or being able to become a professor of mathematics, they all kind of look the same, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that's one issue, right? And that starts really early, right? In elementary school, middle school, as to
Mhm.
sometimes how we sort students into different tracks, how we
Mhm.
tell students who is going to, worthy of being in the honors class or not, and even like, who has access, right, to high level mathematics education, right? So I think that's one of the
And
first issues, right?
And
Yeah.
so that's the demographic disparity that you're describing, right? The
Yeah.
inequality in demographics. But why is that a problem? And
Mhm.
you know, why do you think that's happened?
Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons for that. The first to answer your first question, why is that a problem, right? I think that inherently, as a teacher, right? When I was a seventh, eighth grade teacher, I honestly believe that every single one of my students can do anything they want, right? If you put your mind
Mhm.
to it, if you work hard, right? I mean, we live in a wonderful country where
Mhm.
you really can, right? Within one generation, right? In Brooklyn, many of my students were first or second generation immigrants, right? This idea of the American dream, if you work hard within one generation, you can do anything you want in the United States, right?
Mhm.
And while that is true, right, what would really hurt me sometimes as a seventh grade teacher, as an eighth grade teacher, is then I would hear my students who are brilliant, and then they get in high school and they go, "Oh, you know what? I have to take algebra again because I couldn't pass the test, or I got sorted into a class and the class is huge. There's maybe 40 people and it's just not
Mhm.
me. And there's no the teacher only calls on the boys anyway, and so I think I'm not going to try taking advanced level math classes anymore." Right. And these stories of students self-selecting out because they've been positioned as I'm not a math person or math is something that doesn't make sense to me. Right. It
Mhm.
occurs more to students who have less privilege, right? Like I think over the last 40 years, we've done a really good
Mhm.
job in math and STEM as to closing the gender gap, right? As to really
Mhm.
bringing a lot of female scientists and mathematicians into the game, right? But we haven't done that so much with in terms of diversity, and so I think that's one of the
Yeah.
issues is right, like we
Mhm.
we want a world in which the kids that we're working with can look and say, oh my goodness, like I look at NASA, I look at the National Science Foundation, I look at scientists, I look at engineers around the country, and many of them look like me. I can do it too, right?
Yeah. So you think that part of the problem with this lack of diversity comes from a lack of diversity to set the example for people who are aspiring in those fields?
I think a lot of it comes from that. Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from representation, right? I mean, I'd say, it's no coincidence. I'm a Chinese American male that,
Mhm.
when I was growing up, it wasn't hard for me to find role models who excelled in math and science, right?
Mhm.
And versus, maybe some of my other peers who might not have seen someone like themselves might have self-selected out of that because you just didn't see it, right?
I mean, I can see the logic behind that for sure. I'm curious if the inverse has a little bit of an effect too. If you look at people who are if you look at sports, for example,
Mhm.
and the demographics that make up sports athletes, if people in those kind of ethnic groups are more driven towards sports because they're seeing those examples there, and sports, as we know, has a very high likelihood that people aren't going to go professional and be able to make a career out of it, depending on,
Yeah, yeah.
if you're aspiring to be in the NFL, chances are you're probably not going to be unless you're really in the top 1% of the 1% of the people aspiring.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that segues into one of my favorite math problems, right? To work
Mhm.
with kids, right? Like, for many children, right? It hurts to burst their bubble. Like, okay, let's actually like look at the probability, right, of you becoming a
Mhm.
professional athlete, particularly in the United States, and then look at like what other probabilities there are, right? Like, is it
Yeah.
is it more likely you'll be struck by lightning twice, or is it more likely you'll make it to the NBA, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I like this analysis, right? The inverse of maybe we only see ourselves as excellent, or we only see ourselves in career choices in which we actually see people who look like us, right? And I think
Mhm.
that that's partially true, right? I think that there's a lot to be said about that in the way that we see sports. I think the other it also uh sort of shows the gatekeeping effect of in different industries, right?
Mhm.
In particular, I would say math and engineering and science are ones, particularly for me as an Asian American, there were very few barriers to, right? Like, it was
Mhm.
very easy to see people who look like me excelling in higher education. And for me, going to get my doctorate, going to get a postdoc, right, were not things in which I really felt like, I'm the first a person who looks like me who's walking through these doors. I'm not. There's
Mhm.
many, many people who look like me in those spaces, but there are particular gatekeeping mechanisms that mean that that's one of the only places that I can excel, right? Like, for instance, sports, right? I
Yeah.
would have loved to be an NBA player, right? But, like, okay, first off, I'm not
Lifestyle seems pretty exciting, at
yeah,
least.
right?
The
It
paycheck.
seems it's a paycheck, right? That seems like, yeah, like, you get a dollar on the world, right? It seems awesome. But, you know, it's not just that I'm not that great at basketball, right? But also that those spaces are just not as open. I think for someone like me,
Mhm.
there's a lot of barriers for an Asian American making it into sports, right? Whether it's sorting mechanisms to happen at the middle school and high school level in terms of sports, right? I see a lot of parallels in math, right? There's a lot of
Mhm.
systems in place that are just used to sort people, right?
Yep.
In math in
But
particular, right? Yeah.
if I was going to push back on that point a little bit and try to figure out, why is that?
Hmm.
Me personally in my life, I tend to pick the most difficult path for some reason, and
Hmm.
um, I also tend not to really care what other people
Hmm.
think and what the
Hmm.
people around me look like or acting like or whatever. I just jump right in, and you get what you get.
Yeah.
But I think there's a big emphasis in not just education, but for the youth today that they feel like they need to be like these issues are brought to them because people need to feel like they're a victim at sometimes. And that
Mm,
victim
mm.
mentality is really present. It wasn't my generation
Yeah.
when I graduated high school, and God, I don't remember when I graduated high school. Someone just 2011 or something. um, but it was already there, right? You could already
Yeah.
see a lot of people making excuses for themselves because of either their background or just because they wanted to be a victim and they had to make up their own category. To
Mm,
then now today, where I think it's even worse, where people are told, you're not going to be successful because of XYZ. The chances of you being successful are less because of your ethnic background or whatever it might
mm.
be. And and I think that is really a bad effect on kids too, to even
Yeah.
acknowledge that, to say that to them.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up some really good points that I would say are in my mind, are more effects of a system as opposed to the causes of things that are happening,
Okay.
right? I think that there's, well, one, right, um the idea of a victim mentality, I think is real. As a college professor, right, I've seen a lot of students sometimes, see themselves as positioned like, everything is tough. It's really hard. I can't do this, and therefore I won't. Right. And that,
Mhm.
that baffles me. Right. As a professor of everything here is designed to support you. Why can't you do it? Right.
Yeah.
But
Well, it's easy, it's also really easy in life to find reasons why things won't work and why you
yeah,
won't succeed. It's easier to do
yeah.
that than to just do it.
Then to do it. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And so that's been a frustrating part, I think, as an educator. But I would also say, I think that this generation, and we're talking about, Gen Z, right? The
Mhm.
kids coming up, I would say that they also see through a lot of the ridiculousness, right, of the
Mhm.
societies that we had to get through, right? And see that sometimes, right, like this idea that I always say you can be whatever you want if you work hard, right? But this idea that it's a meritocracy, that if you bust your butt and you work hard, then that means you'll excel. Like, creates this idea of competition that we're fighting against. We're fighting amongst each other. We're fighting amongst our friends for maybe a coveted position,
Mhm.
at a university, or in a fellowship or in a company. And I see that, sometimes there's some strength in saying that, what, I don't want to play this game. Right? This game, I see people who are successful and they're not happy, and so why would I want to do that? Right? Like, I want to
Mhm.
maintain a level of my own success defined in the ways I want to do it. Right? And so, um, you know, I I'm not necessarily pushing back, but I would say I think I as an educator have started to have a lot more compassion over the
Mhm.
ways that students are positioning themselves, and then trying to understand, like, oh, you know what? I'm actually part of the system. Like, I work at a university. Like, I'm often right. Like, if the students stop coming to my university, I
Mhm.
have no tuition revenue, and I'd probably be out of
Yeah.
a job, right? So I'm I'm actually part of a system in which I see a lot of a lot of the inequities played out, in that we just want students in the classrooms, whether or not they're emotionally right, or ready to engage.
Yeah.
Right.
And we've actually talked about that on the podcast before in the past. The
Hmm.
education industry being, it's thought of as like the representing the underprivileged, and representing, people who are trying to fight against the man, and that's kind of the idea that education is actually built for
Hmm.
it, the brand that it's kind of
Hmm.
built in society. Yet the inverse is true. It's the largest industry in the United States. I'd say one of the largest industries in the United States. And on the previous podcast, we actually discussed a little bit of numbers around it,
Hmm.
being that if you combine the gross revenue of Apple, Google, and I believe, I don't know if it was Facebook or one other, and the entire gross income for all the electricity bought in the United States together, it's still
Hmm.
less than the annual income for the education sector in the United States. So
Yeah,
it's pretty crazy to think about how
I
powerful
love
these
that.
institutions are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would say, uh, that the numbers don't lie, right? I mean, that's pretty
Yeah.
impressive, right? And that's a really nice math problem, right? To jump
Mhm.
into. But
Yeah.
but I wouldn't say that it's power, right? I would say,
Yeah.
as someone who works in education, right? Like, I think that, the tech companies probably have a lot more societal
Power.
power. Yeah, right.
You think?
Then
I mean, I don't know. Like, that's tough, right? Because a lot of
yeah,
people, especially after what just happened with Harvard,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and with the Harvard president being
yeah.
replaced, the what would you call that when they were brought into Capitol Hill? Did you call that like an
Hearing.
interrogation? I mean, it
Yeah,
was it
yeah,
was a bunch of politicians trying to make themselves feel good by creating
yeah,
sound bites for themselves, but value did come out of that. We
yeah,
saw a
yeah,
lot of really what seemed to the average person crazy opinions, and
yeah,
having
yeah,
trouble really understanding what's the disconnect between the top universities who
yeah.
they create our next presidents, they create our next senators, our top business people in the world, and this is the opinion that these universities have. This is crazy.
Mm,
It's hard for people to
mm.
understand. How do you kind of feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I can understand. I can understand the multiple perspectives, and particularly the distrust of elite institutions, of not being able to really understand, like, what, just the ideas and the opinions of most of the people, most of their own students, and most of the families that support them. I would say, though, in those cases, and this is sort of like, my insider perspective as being a professor, I think the modern university has become very much a corporation too, right? And
Yeah.
so our presidents are wonderful people, and at one time were probably amazing academics and scholars, but are mainly put in a place where they're a public face of a large corporation and are in charge of fundraising and maintaining relationships. And so
Yeah.
oftentimes, right, like what happens is they become extremely disconnected, right, with
Yeah.
what
And
their
that
faculty and assistants are
and
doing.
that's
Yeah.
really obvious, right? We talked about the absolute size of the industry. They
Mhm.
are actually very active. I never actually even thought of it that way, but these university presidents are actually probably more active running what is an enterprise than, being a part of the day-to-day in the school.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can look at universities in which, when a president leaves, right, oftentimes they're run by an interim, or sometimes they might not even have a president, and the university still runs fine.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
They might not be raising the same amount of money, funds, right? They might not have as many events, but I think that, I think this is sort of what shows, this is a much different issue, right? Is
Mhm.
the sort of corporatization of education, right? And sort of the ways that we as humans create these organizations that become so big and so powerful that their main goal is just to continue, right, replicating that power, right?
Yeah. And I don't think that's productive for people, right? So for example, why should somebody who's interested in getting a higher education go into debt for the next 10 to 15 years? It doesn't make
No, it
sense
makes
to me.
no sense, right? Absolutely. I mean, the math is sort of ridiculous, and so I think this is the sort of moment that we're in, right? In the United States, in 2025, is figuring out, how are people going to survive in the future?
Yeah.
I feel you on this, right? Like, I say, I mean, this comes back to why I do what I do in terms of math, right? You have to be able to make logical decisions. You have to be able to understand numbers. You have to be able to understand, like, how much does it cost? If you're taking out these loans, how much is it
Yeah.
really going to cost to pay them off, right?
Yeah.
And, if you want to study for a while, if you want to go to college, you want to study something specific, right? Do you want to study something, right, that you're passionate about, or do you want to study something that's going to allow you to to earn the particular wage that you think you deserve, right?
Yeah. But if you're going to earn 5 to 10% more and you're going to have to spend the next 10 years paying that off, I don't know. It doesn't seem to make
Yeah.
it doesn't work out properly. Do you ever actually, it's kind of interesting. Do you ever talk to your students about the math problem that they might face as a result of the choice to be in your classroom?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually it's a tough conversation I often have with my students. So because I work in
Mhm.
math education, many of my students are people who are involved in education. They're people who want to become
Mhm.
teachers, want to become administrators, or they're
Yeah.
practicing teachers or administrators
Mhm.
or math coaches. And I would say I get to work with a really beautiful and amazing group of people because these are people who've dedicated their lives to education, oftentimes public education. Working
Yeah.
with anybody who just shows up in our country or just ends up in a school, right? And how do we best
Mhm.
support them? But what kills me is many of them very much know they're making a huge sacrifice in their
Mhm.
lifetime earning potential, in their comfort of their life, right?
Mhm.
Even in their ability to choose, where to live, right? Because
Yeah.
they've chosen education as a pathway, and that's really terrifying, right? Is that it's almost seen as like as you're making a substantial sacrifice just to become an educator.
Yeah. It makes sense. That's true. It
Yeah,
shouldn't be that way. We should have better incentive structures for that. I actually I played around with a lot of fun education app ideas. Just nothing serious. Once my daughter started going to school, and I was like, well, how come nothing's really set up for the high tech world here? Why is it that I can't go to a
yeah,
marketplace of teachers, find the
yeah,
best one that I'd like, and pay them whatever they want, right? And I
yeah,
don't mean that as in, oh, we can throw around as much money as we want to hire these teachers. No, I mean, like, teachers often want to make more money if we had a marketplace for them to compete where people could select, I want this teacher because they've excelled at teaching kids between the age of 5 and 10 in
yeah,
mathematics. I'm going to hire that teacher, and people are fighting over that teacher. The price is going to continue to go up and it'll be justified based off their merits. And
yeah.
so that kind of stuff seemed really exciting to me. And I'm like, why does that not exist today still?
So John, I love this idea, but I think on a on a much more hidden level that system does exist, particularly here in the United States, right? Like,
Okay.
I was at Harvard, right? I did my undergrad at Johns Hopkins. Like, there is a very hidden curriculum in the United States as to which institutions are the elite institutions, which spaces to go, where to send your kids if you have the money to pay, so that they'll have access to higher quality education, right? I mean, we know these things, right? We know, right, that when we actually break like do standardized tests such as the SAT or ACT, what we're really measuring, right, is the level of privilege and maybe the neighborhoods they grew up in, right, as opposed to like their actual math or literacy levels, right? We know that the system, public education in the United States, is very much about how much money you have in order to play the game well. It might not be as
The
nice
public
as a,
system or the private system? Sorry.
sorry. I would say the entire education system, right? And
Really?
so
Okay.
if you have the money, right, it's not hard to find to ask around to find out where the best private schools are. Getting in is the hard part, right?
Yeah.
Having the money, maybe
So
and oftentimes
so what
there's other things, right? Yeah.
yeah, so what creates that opportunity gap in the public sector at least? What's the main cause of that, you think?
Um, let me ask you to maybe explain your question a little bit more.
Okay. So you said that like finances,
Mhm,
and the ability for parents to kind of I guess contribute to an
mhm.
education system for somebody, or to education for somebody, seems to dictate the potential success they might have. That's how I understood what you were saying,
Sure,
right?
sure.
So the more well off somebody is, even if they're in the public sector or the public education system, they will tend to do better in their educational career.
Mhm, mhm.
Why?
I think a lot of it has to do with the ways that our public education system is based on real estate tax revenue, right?
Okay.
So
Mhm.
you look at in the United States, you look at where and so when I was at Harvard, right, it's really fascinating looking at and you can do this with any institution. You look at what are the high schools that the kids are coming to, right? If I'm at Stanford, I'm at UC Berkeley, right, one of
Mhm.
these elite institutions, what are the high schools that the kids are coming from? And oftentimes you have a lot of kids coming from the same schools, right?
Mhm.
And where are these schools located? They might be in big cities, but where in particular in these cities are they located, right? And
Mhm.
and and you can see that there's a few districts across the nation that are producing a disproportionate amount of our students who get sent to the elite private schools.
Okay, so I've actually looked up the information before in the past on
Sure.
revenue for the local school district here that I'm in for my daughter. Because I was like, okay,
Mhm,
so how would I claim? Because I've always heard that the area where I live in here has a very good school district for the
mhm,
public system, and so I was trying to
mhm.
determine, do we do public or private? That whole
Yeah.
conversation. So I looked up the sources of the revenue for the local school district here, and a lot of it comes from federal, and a lot of it comes from the county, and
Mhm,
then the city, and the local taxes from real estate didn't make up as much of a percentage of it as I thought.
mm,
Although I would say the fact that the area that I'm in has as a higher than probably much higher than average for the area income, I would presume that would be the education system there is probably better for a number of reasons, not just limited to the real estate tax income.
yeah. Yeah.
But I don't know why necessarily, other than you can just guess. You have higher income
Yeah.
families in the area. They're probably donating more to the school, contributing more for the extracurriculars. The teachers that are in the area, are sourced from similar families, etc.
Mhm.
Is this why you think that a lot of areas that are poor generally have worse kind of?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's harder, right? If like as a teacher, right? If I'm working in a place in which almost all of my students have families who every adult in the household is working maybe two, three jobs just to survive, right? I'll never see those parents show up at a math night, right, or a parent teacher conference, right? I'll never be able to get them to show up taking a field trip in which we go visit, like a science museum or really have some fun. I mean, small things like that, have large repercussions into the access that the kids have to really fun things that happen maybe outside of the classroom, outside just the day-to-day curriculum, right?
And the reason that they're not showing up for those things, you think, is strictly financial, or is it because these families every parent's busy working, they can't take off work to even show up to the parent teacher conference, or why do you think is the driving factor there?
I mean, I think there's a lot of it's inequity that we see in the United States, right? You have people who live in areas in which they just, it's hard to make a living, right? It's and or you have immigrant families who are not being able to get hired, maybe because they don't have the training or they don't have the education, right? I think in particular, right, what we see when we go to school districts and go to places that are, technically struggling, and I would say, we're using very broad terms here, and I would say, a good school district or a bad school district. I mean, these are all relative terms, right? But I would say, maybe school districts are schools that know how to play the game of achievement well, which is, I think, very different than whether they're doing well in school, right? Like there are, very specific assessment metrics that we use for schools, right? How many of them graduate from a four-year institution? Sorry, how many graduate from high school and then enter into a four-year institution? How many of them do well on SAT? How many of them take AP credits, right? Those don't necessarily mean that their kids are smarter, right? But they're really nice metrics to be able to show success, right?
Yeah.
And
I definitely
like
agree
any
with that.
metric in the game.
Tests won't show the brilliance of one kid or another. You give the perfect test scores, and I absolutely agree. And so talking about that and having those discrepancies in schools feeding into higher education, how does that? So if I think we've established, so far there are some issues that people are trying to solve today, and one of the proposed solutions for that is this DEI style agenda. What is DEI, and how are we, how do we think that's going to actually help solve these problems?
Okay, that's a good question. So it's been sort of interesting for me, right? In that this term just sort of shows up, and now it's everywhere, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And I've been connecting my work in math education to equity, right, for 20 years now. And then now suddenly, right, I'm being lumped into work around diversity, equity, and education. I'm like, you know what? I guess so. Diversity is cool. I've never said, oh, we need more diversity in what I do in math education. It's just always, assume that the more, diversity is nice, but it's not the end goal. It's a start, right? It's good to have more people in the room with different ideas, different backgrounds, that you have a better conversation. You learn better, right? In terms of equity, I think that the term equity is sort of, it's thrown around so much that I don't think it really means anything anymore in our public discourse, right? I mean,
it's become extremely propaganda. It's become a part of propaganda.
Yeah, right, yeah. So I would say, my definition of equity is, right, that we're able to help fix injustices in the past, so that everyone, right, no matter who they are or where they come from, not just has an equal access to education, but has one that's catered to them, right? That one that understands the backgrounds that they come from, and maybe the hardships that their family might or might not have faced, right? But in terms of inclusion, here's where I think it's really fun, right? Because I'll say, in my own classroom, it's really, really hard for students who might learn differently to succeed. And that's just because of the structures that we have in math, right? Like, I just recently started working with one of my colleagues, Tiffany Wild, does a lot of work on working with students with visual impairments. And these students, some of them call themselves blind. Some of them say that I'm a student with visual impairments and not fully blind. But man, do they, do we as math teachers not know how to work with them in terms of even simple things? Like, how do you graph, right? How do you understand and build a histogram? How do you do statistical analysis and look at the curve, right? And for me, this focus on DEI has helped me realize, like, okay, we're really going to be inclusive. Can we imagine, right, what it means to do calculus and do statistics without constantly looking at visual representations of graphs?
See, that explanation of DEI is very reasonable, and that sounds like something that education in general should be pursuing, right? What I think has become the public conversation today is DEI is seen as like hand picking people based off their ethnic backgrounds to try to make up a classroom that's diverse while ignoring people's merits. And that's what I guess in society today, that term has become for a lot of people, either in the center or right of center. And Elon Musk being one of the big people out there cheering about how terrible it is.
Well, I would say, I mean, I was a fan of Elon Musk, but there's some things he knows a lot about. There's some things that he just talks about, right?
Well, I figured that out when he started running Twitter and saw what he was doing to it over the last, I don't know how long he's had it. I'm sitting here going, I was like, if he would have just he could have just texted me, "Is this a good idea?" I could have told him no. It would have saved him a few billion. But yeah, what's the difference between DEI and the way you see it and the
Yeah.
way that I guess it's become politically?
Yeah, I like what you're getting at. I think that the term DEI and just like the term CRT, critical race theory, you know, I think a lot of times people are using them in public discourse and really just saying that they're terrible things without fully maybe not understanding or really that's not what they're talking about. I think that right now when people are saying, like, oh, what happened? Like, I saw yesterday, this horrible tragedy that happened in Baltimore, right?
Mhm.
With the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And then the mayor of Baltimore comes out, and then he's been labeled on Twitter as the DEI mayor, right? And like,
Yeah.
what does that necessarily mean, right? Why, like, is he a proponent of diversity, equity, and education, or is it because he's a young black male in leadership, and then maybe people see that as a threat, right? Or
Oh,
they
I
see
don't
that.
I don't think it's either one, to be honest.
Okay, okay,
If I'm going to analyze that, I think it's the people who are against him politically think that he's advocating for people to either join his administration, join the workforce, whatever he can do within his control. I
hmm,
think they believe that he's going to pick people based off their ethnicity and their
ah,
background rather than off their merits. And that is
okay,
a concern that I think they have. I'm not saying that's mine. It's not saying
yeah.
that's my interpretation, but from what I've seen, that's what it feels like.
Sure, sure. And so I understand that fear, right? This fear. If we live in a world, I mean, this goes back to math, right? If we live in a world in which we're told that there's only space for so many people, right? That
Mhm.
only some people can make it to the top. I mean, this happens in math classes all the time. And I hate that I keep bringing it back to the math class, but I think the math class is where the roots of a lot of our trauma exist, right? Only some students are going to get an A. I mean, I remember being in a college class, right? And I have arguments with math professors all the time who still grade on a curve. They're
Mhm.
like, "You know what? Even though every kid in my class is brilliant, 2 of them will get a fail because
Yeah.
that's just the way the curve works." And it drives me
Mhm.
crazy. I'm like, even if they're all, like, brilliant mathematicians, 2 of
Mhm.
them still have to fail, like, that's just how the curve works, right?
Yeah,
And so
that
I think
sucks. That sucks.
it sucks.
I've also been on the inverse side of that where I was in, I can't remember what it was. I think it was operating systems class in
Mhm.
college. And so many people failed that they had to make a curve because the scores were so bad just so
Yeah,
that
right?
somebody would pass.
Yeah. No, I think I might have been in a similar I remember being in an operating systems class, right? And like, the average score in the class was like a 14.
Yeah. Yeah, it
So I was like,
sucked.
I got a 13. Yes, right? Like,
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
just on the average, right? But I think, that mentality, right, of there have to be some people who are at the top and some people at the bottom, I think permeates the way a lot of us see the world, right? And so I think it leads to this idea that, oh, it's a zero-sum game. If some people are gonna be in the top, some people are gonna be forced out, right?
Yeah.
And if I have been told my whole life that, like, I live in this amazing democratic meritocracy of the United States, and I will be judged on the merit of that work, and then suddenly the game is switched on me, where it's
Mhm.
about ethnic background or race or whether or not, they have a much more tragic life story than I do, then I totally understand that anger, right? Like,
Yeah.
things have been shifted on me, and now the game is unfair. Like, this is not the system that I was told I need to work towards, right?
Mhm.
And that sucks, right?
Yeah.
And I think that unfortunately, I mean, for me, living as an Asian American and then living through all the rhetoric around affirmative action, right?
Mhm.
It's been really interesting because, like, there are many people in my own community who are on multiple sides of the issue of affirmative action, right? Is Are people being chosen because of their race? I would say
Mhm.
no, right? But are there longer, bigger picture systemic issues that deal with historical injustices that we're trying to rectify through policy? And I would say that that can be done well, and when it's done well, it's a wonderful thing. But when it's done haphazardly, I think that's when, people get really angry, right? And I think
Yeah.
justifiably so, but it also leads to then we're gonna get rid of all, racial-based decision making, or we're gonna
Yeah.
not understand, the histories of certain peoples. And I think that actually, like, in any system, when one person wins all, right? We try to make one blanket rule. Sometimes everyone loses, right?
Yeah. Well, what I think is interesting, because you said that in some scenarios there is a certain systemic kind of uh, I guess historical pattern where some people were kept down, or some groups of people are really just kept down, or they're just getting to the table today and they have to work
Yeah,
their way up,
yeah.
right? And so that was the example that you'd brought in. And so, how can you effectively help those people without putting somebody else down? And I know you kept saying it's not a zero sum game, but there is a fixed number of slots that of entry into universities, and there's a fixed number of, I guess, dollars to allocate towards scholarships. So, if you want to help one group that has been disproportionately affected in a negative way, with that, how do you do that without pulling down people who are coming from more statistically successful groups? But, it feels like you're moving away from the ideal of meritocracy to do that.
Yeah, thanks for putting it so well, John. I mean, this is exactly the issue that's going on with affirmative action in the United States, right? I think that, within my own community of Asian Americans, right, there's been a lot of Asian Americans who feel like, hey, getting rid of affirmative action is actually helpful for us because maybe, like a university right now, they might not admit it, but they're trying to cap it at maybe 45-50% Asian American because
Yeah.
they're looking at the numbers of how they admit, and they realize that, they actually, like, if we just follow these numbers, it'd be like 70 or 80% Asian American, right? But,
Yeah.
and there's many issues for that, right? There's the ways the model minority myth is operated, the access, right, to capital that many Asian
Mhm.
immigrants have. And even stereotypes, right? And who's able to be successful, right? But, on the other hand, I would say, and I keep going back to the math classroom, right? it's I don't, and maybe I'm idealistic, right? But I think that everybody can succeed, and maybe everyone might not succeed in the ways that they might think are successful now, right? Like in my math class, maybe only a handful of my kids will go on to become engineers, mathematicians, or do something in their job that actually relates to mathematics, right? But everybody will become confident in who they are and learn to trust their own instincts and know that they can solve any problem they can. And whether they become mathematicians or not, I'm still happy, right? I'm still
Mhm.
happy because they've learned to question the world. They've learned to make sense of the world around them. They've learned that any problem can be solved if they're thoughtful about it, and they break it down, right? And they can work with other people, right? And so perhaps I'm being idealistic, right? But, this idea that if we take away something from one group, or if we try to rectify past uh, uh, injustices,
Inequality. Mhm.
yeah, inequalities, that we're actually taking away something from a group that has dominant power now, right? I think that that's a very, I mean, I understand the anger behind it, but I think that's a very short term loss. And when in reality, what happens when we create a more diverse society, just like in my math class, when we focus more on reasoning and inquiry and having math fun, as opposed to everyone doing well on a test,
Mhm.
those long-term skills, right, that my students develop end up staying with them for life, right? And I
Mhm.
and I and I and I'm hopeful that in a society in which we have a more diverse and just ways of defining success, that okay, right now, right, we don't have as many spaces, right, at the top institutions for people who maybe look like me, Asian Americans, right, or maybe people, white Americans, right? But in reality, right, that'll actually lead to a better society, right? That
I can
there'll be
I
more
can
emerald.
understand the concept that what it sounds to me is like you're saying, hey, let's take, if I was to put this in business terms, it sounds like you're saying let's take some profits off the table and invest it into the future. And that's what it sounds like, right? So let's take a certain
Yeah.
percentage of our profits, not distribute it to our stakeholders, and let's invest
Mhm.
it into the future of the company. I get that argument, but I think that there's a lot of people who don't buy that this kind of, you know reserving slots for certain groups to make up for historical biases or
Mhm.
historical problems. I think there's a lot of people who are saying, I don't think that's fair and I don't think that's worth it, especially not to my kids today as we
Yeah,
see it.
yeah. I get that, right? I get that,
Yeah.
as a parent myself, right? I mean, right? Like, I'm selfishly want the best for my kids, right? No
Mhm.
matter what cost, right? And sometimes that goes in the ways, right? Of like, like, I mean, even small things, right? Like, it's really easy for me, like you're talking about, like being able to choose the right education system and schooling for your kids. because of the access that I have as an educator and someone who lives and works in school districts and knows schools, it's really easy for me to make choices as to which schools I want my kids to go to, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
And is it and I feel guilty of like, okay, I know exactly which schools are the best, but I also know that these schools that are not doing very well actually need really good parents in their schools to become better, right?
Yeah. Well, I definitely get that. If you have a bad school or bad, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't want to call
yeah,
certain districts or
yeah,
schools
yeah,
bad, but I
yeah,
mean, if you go to an underperforming, if I'm going to use the correct
yeah,
buzzword, I think
yeah,
anyway, if you go to an
yeah, yeah,
underperforming area and you introduce children or parents from an overperforming area, that could certainly help to bring them up.
yeah.
I definitely get that argument. I just don't get the concept that's hard for me is to say, I know that, we've got the top 100, we got the top 100 mathematicians in the United
Mhm.
States, and these are the ones who want to be in your classroom. And we go, yeah, but we're going to take out 20 to 30% of the best mathematicians because we need to meet certain quotas.
Yeah,
I get why you want to invest in that, like why people want to invest in that future. I
yeah,
understand it, but for a lot of people, you know, it doesn't seem right, and I don't know
yeah.
that just because I understand it that I would even support it. It doesn't. It I
Yeah,
don't.
yeah, I hear you, and I understand that. I understand that anger, right? I understand that if you're in a system in which you were told, right, like I've done everything I should do to succeed, and then suddenly it doesn't work, right? Suddenly
Mhm.
I've been told that I can't succeed, not based on the work that I've done and the hard work I've put in, but because of who I am. I mean, that
Yeah.
hurts, right?
But
Yeah.
actually, it is kind of weirdly realistic for the
Hmm.
world to say, like I was always
Yeah,
told it is a meritocracy, and I've worked
yeah,
really hard.
yeah,
Like I've always worked my butt off trying to create a future for myself. And then I realized, oh wait, it doesn't matter how hard I work because that person over there negotiated a better contract, and I'm working harder, and so I got
yeah,
screwed. So it's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh, okay, part of life is also recognizing that it's also unfair.
Yeah, 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 and then learning to be okay with that, right? Learning to
Yeah,
to to to,
or
to not,
learning to
yeah,
learn from
yeah.
what was unfair.
Well, I mean,
But
I always I try to tell my students particularly, right? Like it's like the first time a student fails a math test, so the first time someone does something it does terribly in school, I'm like, you know what? It's better that this happens to you now, right?
mhm,
Because it's really hard to deal with, right? But it's part of being an adult is learning to deal with failure and learning to move on, right? You
yeah.
know, yeah,
Absolutely. Well, I want to bring in some questions from Hedgehog, the social
sure.
media platform. I had asked the community on my post about having my third or
Ooh.
fourth coffee today. About what
I love it.
concerns
Yeah.
people have for DI. Yeah, those iced coffees. I can't stop. I can't put them down. So we can start. We can start with
Hmm.
the I guess the comment that's up there.
Sure.
Excuse the name of
This is
the
fun one, right?
individual. Yeah, I know. You get hey, people have strong opinions.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so this one reads, how is lowering or removing academic standards because they
Mm,
have a negative impact on minorities, not saying minorities are less intelligent. I think it's a little bit of an offensive
mhm,
take, but that
yeah.
is what some people are saying, right? So how would you
Mm.
address that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I know of anyone who's lowering or removing academic standards. I think people
Okay.
are looking at things like assessments and looking like things as testing and understanding the biases that are deeply embedded within them, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, small things, right? Like, um, a lot of our standardized tests, traditionally have really just been about how well you understand, middle class American culture and how well you read, American English, right?
Yeah.
Very little to do with like for me, like it's very little to do with the actual mathematical thinking, right? So,
I agree with that quite a bit actually, because like if you think about it, tests are not for everybody. There's only a
mhm,
certain kind of person that's really excelling at tests, and if you look
mhm,
at the makeup of the people who are most successful, I think in business and in innovation, they're probably
mhm.
not the ones getting A's.
Absolutely, absolutely, right? And so I think this is one of the beautiful parts about our American education system, right? It's really easy to rag on it, right? But I think that
Mhm.
in the United States, we're really good at producing creative thinkers, and we're really good at getting students to learn to work with each other, right? And
Yeah,
so when I see like a post like this, right? I mean, I think it's a little bit exaggerated, but I can
it
understand the
is.
sentiment, right?
Yeah,
Is hey, we're making things like dumber. We're making school dumber. It's like no, we're actually focusing more on things like collaboration, right? And,
Yeah, it's different, not necessarily dumber. I do agree with you on that because, personally, having gone through, everyone's gone through at least some sort of education system.
Mhm.
I can tell you it was not designed for me. And I'm sure
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
not designed for a lot of other people in this
yeah,
country. The
yeah.
next question that we had on there was, if you might scroll down, there we go.
Mhm.
No, I asked what question they would
Uh-huh.
ask, and they say no question because it can only be sarcastic. Mathematics, they should know when something is logical if they are into
Mm,
math and what isn't.
mhm,
Maybe it's time to remove things like sex and color from all applications and base everything
mm.
solely on merit again. We're watching too many things be infected by some crazy notion. I will just end it there.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
that still gets at the sentiment, right? This is the
Yeah,
brand that DEI has created in
yeah,
society today, and this is ultimately what people are talking about when they talk about it. At least when they're coming from a highly critical perspective.
yeah, yeah.
What do we
Yeah, I
have?
get it.
You know,
I think one thing that I see here that I see a lot is people oftentimes think of math as just purely logical. Like math only exists and maybe in this cultural political free zone, and students
Mhm.
should think about it, but shouldn't connect to history or
Have
shouldn't
they looked
connect
into
to
chaos theory or like I don't know?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely, right? Or even, I mean, like we in the United States, right? I mean, like, voting theory, right, is
Mhm.
such an amazing and wonderful part of mathematics, and yet it has direct applications, right, into gerrymandering how we vote today, right?
Yeah,
So I think it's a myth that mathematics can be just about logic and completely political and neutral. Politically and culturally neutral, right? I think that there's no way that that happens, but um, just like I was saying earlier, right? Like in a lot of math classes, right? When math is taught devoid of connections to real world, it is taught in a cold and calculating way that is just about regurgitation
Mhm.
and being able to memorize procedures. And maybe, and this is what I hate to say, a lot of people actually excelled in that, right? A lot of people,
Mhm.
I would say, very different than your experience, John, excelled in a form of mathematics that was just about regurgitation.
Yeah.
And if that's and if they found happiness in getting the A and doing well on a test and maybe
Mhm.
having their test put on the board and
Mhm.
getting a yellow ribbon, and if
Mhm.
that's their comfort of success,
Mhm.
now, right, their tables have been turned because now as they get in the future and they get in the real world, it's like, no, math is actually much more complex and it
Yeah.
connects to all sorts of different things. I can see them having anger of like, oh my gosh, I was told that math was just about logic, right? Not
Yeah.
that it actually has deeper applications into everything that I do, right?
Yeah, well, and that's absolutely correct too. Because if we look back at my education in computer science and now applying what I have either learned or didn't into how I'm running business today, we don't even look at people's college degrees anymore at all when
Yeah.
we hire
Yeah.
for any type of software engineering role. I've had people that I went to college with who are excellent at every test. They were getting straight A's. They were killing all the projects, doing great, and then they go out in the real world and they're useless. They can't, I mean, not useless, but like they can't justify their value to the company based off the salary we're paying them. And so it's like, well, how do you beat that? Well, we had to build
Yeah.
our own testing mechanisms and everything for hiring engineers. But that I think speaks to your concerns about DEI in the very least is how do we, the real definition, not the societal definition that we have today, which
Mhm.
is, how do we make it so that education is more reflective of real life across
Yeah.
the diversity of problems that people face in the world, as well as the diversity of backgrounds.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
got one more question from you from Olin. Which would the professor feel more safe flying with? A highly trained pilot that has proven to be one of the best, or B, a DEI based hire because of their ethnicity? Once again, I think that shows that people always tie this back to their ethnicity. That also is I think a reference to Elon Musk on Twitter, who has been raving about how I guess somehow, at least my understanding was, it seemed like you think that all the conspiracy around all of the plane issues we've been having lately somehow
Yeah.
has to do
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
DEI. But I mean, I think I'd like to let you answer the question, but I mean, to me, I think everybody would say we want the pilot trained best based off of their qualifications alone.
Yeah, and I'll answer this question by asking another question, right? And so one thing I've been thinking a lot about, right? There's just a prominent cheerleader, I think, for the Kansas City Chiefs, who's a black female who died during childbirth, right? And so, we know that for black women in the United States, childbirth is a very dangerous thing. There's been a number of black women who died during childbirth, and so if you were a Black woman who was, going into the maternity ward and having a baby, would you rather have a highly respected OBGYN who is a white man, but who's dynamite and has gone to the best schools and the best training? Or would you rather have a Black woman who, might not have gone to the top universities, but is an OBGYN who also shares and understands the plight of a Black woman in modern medicine, right? And so I think it's not a they're not the same thing, right? But I think the idea that maybe someone got hired just because of their ethnicity is right is a
Yeah.
little bit obtuse, right? But I think that when we really think about these things, right, we have to understand like there are complex issues and there's many people involved, right? And as the end user and also in the hiring process, right?
Yeah, I can see the future vision that's being sold with it, right? So the
Mhm.
idea that you want to introduce people from a more diverse background into these fields so that in the future we've laid the groundwork and we've invested in getting more people into the marketplace of competition so that people are pushed to be better over time. The argument makes sense. The logic seems sound and that it's
Yeah.
there. It's just whether or not it might have negative side effects in really in fields like flying. But that being said, I also don't think that's what DEI is necessarily about, but it is certainly the perception that people are getting. And I think it's I don't know if you describe it as a fringe group that are pushing it that way, or it is actually reflective of universities and professors as a whole.
I mean, that's a whole other topic, right? I
Yeah.
think that there's something happening within, right, the ways that every issue is seen as having two sides, right, and then people having to choose one side or another, right, and I think that leads to some very stilted discourse. So I appreciate, John, this moment to just talk deeply about these issues and not just sort of say whether they're right or wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and there's a lot of philosophy behind a lot of it too, right? So the concept of giving up on you're not necessarily giving up on a meritocracy to pursue this. The
Yeah.
idea, it sounds like, is that you're trying to invest into a future better meritocracy. But if you were to debate this issue with a majority of people, and even leaving this conversation, I think I've had a more of an open mind about this concept. It doesn't necessarily sell me on thinking, hey, DEI is necessarily the answer, because I don't really know what the answer is. It's a super complex problem that we have in our society, and I think it sucks for anybody who's got to try to solve it.
Yeah, I think these are long, historically complex problems that are not solved just with some simple policy, right? But I think that having an awareness about them, and I think having discourse like this and being able to talk about them openly, right, without sort of villainizing each other is important, right?
Yeah. Well, it's really easy to attack each other and just throw shade. That's basically why social media exists as a whole, and that's not what it should be about.
I know. I hear you. Yeah.
So is there anything that you'd like us to talk about while we're here? Is there anything other things you'd like my audience to know and that you'd like to share with the world?
I think one thing is, I enjoy this conversation and this talk about DEI. I would say, particularly for Hedgehog in your audience, right? It's really easy to vilify something and to call something like call someone a DEI hire, right? Or to use DEI as, a boogeyman or a punching bag for particular policies they don't like. But I think I'm always thinking about the future, and maybe that's because of my framework as an educator. I'm always thinking about how to leave the world better, right, than it was in the past. And I think that oftentimes if we have this mentality that the world used to be better and it's actually getting worse, then anything that's coming out new that sort of represents the reasons it's getting worse can be seen as making our future a worse and worse place. And so I would say, it's about sort of empathy, and it's also about thinking about the perspectives of everybody in our society, and how can we make our future better? How can we make the a more just and wonderful space for all of our children, right? And I think that the world right now, especially the United States, it works for a certain amount of people, right? It's worked very much for me, John. It seems to have worked for you, right? Like, even though, right, like, I mean, your education system, your educational background sounds very similar to mine in that I didn't like school as a kid. And it's one of the reasons I became an educator, because I really I thought that, education needs to be shooken up a lot, right? But I still am hopeful that we're moving towards a better future, right? And I think some of the things that have been really difficult to understand is, whether it's DEI, whether it's affirmative action, whether it's critical race theory, these are concepts. These are theoretical ideas. Let's talk about them and open them up. And then, okay, policymakers are sometimes just stumbling through them, or sometimes doing them in ways that don't make sense, or sometimes they don't fully understand what they're doing. They're trying to implement things, right? Can we have grace? Can we talk about it? Can we organize, right? To have conversations to do it better, as opposed to just vilifying it, right?
Yeah. Well, it's always easy to vilify change too, especially when you feel like society as a whole is getting worse over time. Whatever the cause of that is, it's easy to vilify anything that's kind of new, and that's unfortunate, but it is the world we live in. I think the other takeaway that I've kind of gotten from this conversation, it's worth kind of highlighting, is that we'd mentioned the concept of a zero-sum game, as if like somehow the entire world is a zero-sum game, and it's hard to conceptualize that it isn't. That like the history is built upon the shoulder of giants, if you will. The software engineering industry is, if I write a framework and somebody else builds on top of that, and then somebody else builds on top of it, somebody built the foundation for most of what ChatGPT is, for example, in the AI space. And now you have, an entire industry built around that framework. So that's what I mean by shoulder of giants. I think the same thing is true of education and economics. Yeah. Just because someone's successful doesn't mean someone else is less successful. It's possible that everybody has won as a result of that transaction. And if we remember that when we're talking about concepts like DEI, that for one group to succeed more than they have historically doesn't mean that you're tearing somebody else down to get there. I think that's an important part to remember for a lot of people.